Good morning. Mr. Scott here. Gonna be walking through some English passages for SAT Practice Test 3. If you look in the chat, I give the page number. We'll be starting with the second passage in that test, so on page 1087. And we'll also be starting with a later passage in the writing and language. I'm gonna just take a minute and pull those PDFs up. But if you haven't downloaded those already, just go to the chat and do that. I'll give you a minute to do so while I explain kind of what our plans are for today. And again, if you have any questions at all as we go through, just feel free to utilize the chat, okay? So what I want to look at today are graphs. Now, some of you might, really loathe, might really like not look forward at all to any sort of SAT problem with a graph in it. On the other hand, some of you might get like really excited. You're like, oh my gosh, graphs, at last, finally something that makes sense. I'm not being asked any questions about like, character motivation or internal reasoning or anything. Just give me the data sets. That's great. And you know what? Both of those are fine. At the end of the day, like these are reading tests. They aren't really, they aren't really math tests, but you do need some basic math literacy in order to work your way through these graph problems. Now, graphs mostly appear in the reading comprehension part of the test. However, as we're going to see today, they can also crop up in writing and language, where you might more expect to kind of be worried about where a comma goes or whether or not a word fits the tone. Sometimes you'll also be asked questions about data or graphic information. So what I want to do today is walk you through a couple of passages, and at least two of those are going to involve graph or data sets of some kind, and just basically go over the basics and how those tie into what we already know about SAT test taking. Hopefully you've internalized a lot of these strategies already in your practice. I hope you've seen, as you get used to these kinds of to this kind of test taking, that it really does begin to shave time off of your overall performance. It might take a little bit of getting used to. It might take some longer time at first, but after all, you're going to start to see the patterns. After a while, you'll start to see, you're not going to be as surprised as the SAT. And if Mr. Anthony and the rest of the Embrace tutors and I can do one thing, it's that, make you less surprised on test day. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up, again, SAT Practice Test 3, and we'll be on the second passage within that. Share my screen here. And again, please utilize the chat if you have any questions as we're going along. Let me know if the Zoom is off. I try to keep it legible but also navigable, so you can read it, but I can also get around the test pretty easily. We're going to be starting not with this first one about Lady Carlotta, although that is an interesting one. We're going to be starting past the narrative fiction into this one here, starting with there are 600 million cars on the planet. So I'll give you time to scroll to that. Hopefully you don't get seasick as I'm scrolling through my own PDF here. So hopefully you remember that there are only a few different kinds of passages. We might be faced with a narrative fiction passage, one that just tells a story. We might be faced with a historical passage, one which gives, an excerpt from a larger writing that was written 100, 200 years ago. We might be given a hard science passage or a social science passage. Hard science usually has to do with chemistry or biology. The social sciences, they do have to do with data, but they also have to do with human behavior. And that's more of what we're looking at here. As you can see, there's a lot of data that we'll have to navigate, but it's not about DNA. It's not about the behavior of honeybees or chameleons. It's all about the behavior of people. So what do we do first? Let's dive in. What do we do first? Well, you probably know at this point, the first thing we always do is read the blurb. And again, this is on page 1087. This is on page 1087. And oh, I do have a general question about the essay section coming up in the chat. I'll address that. I'll address that really quickly. There's other tutors who can probably speak about this more in depth than myself. The essay section is usually voluntary. It's usually a thing that a lot of colleges don't require you take. However, if you are at all competitive about your SAT score, if you want that extra edge, we recommend that you do take the essay section. So again, not mandatory for most schools, but some schools may require it. And the good news about that essay score is that once a college administrator sees that, they can't unsee it, right? So if you have a good essay score, then that's going to help you, even if the school didn't ask for it. If you volunteer that information and you're a strong SAT taker. Yes, and Mr. Anthony's popping in here. Oh, we have some breaking news. A bulletin's just been handed to me. All right, so as of last week, literally, the SAT is removing the SAT essay portion. Is that a weight off your shoulders, Brielle? Hopefully. Hopefully that helps you all breathe a little easier. That's one less thing to keep track of, okay? And maybe, yeah. All right. Some other questions in the chat. Also asking about what if we already signed up for the essay portion? Well, I'll let Mr. Anthony handle that. But I'm going to start diving into this passage here. Thank you, Mr. Anthony, for that breaking SAT news. So, one less thing to keep track of. And all we have to worry about right now, all we have to worry about is this passage right in front of us. So let's go ahead and take a peek. The first thing we want to do is read the blurb. So right up here, this is going to give us some idea of the main idea going forward. And it says this passage is adapted from Taras Gresko, Strap Hanger, Saving Our Cities and Ourselves from the Automobile. And, again, this is a thing that I stress. Pronunciation is not a thing you'll have to worry about on the SAT. But we already have a pretty good idea of the main idea here, saving our cities and ourselves from the automobile. So we know we're going to be talking about cars, about transportation, and probably be talking about it in some way that imagines a future beyond the car, right? Where we're no longer dependent on this kind of transportation. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but the blurb has already given us a pretty good idea. So what do we do after we've read the blurb? Well, next we're going to sandwich this passage. Get something like the first and last sentence of each paragraphs. Now, some of these paragraphs are only 2 sentences, so that's going to give us some good connective tissue there. Let's dive in. Though there are 6 million cars on the planet and counting, there are also 7 billion people, which means that for the vast majority of us, getting around involves taking buses, ferry boats, commuter trains, streetcars, and subways. In other words, traveling to work, school, or the market means being a strap hanger, somebody who, by choice or necessity, relies on public transport rather than on a privately owned automobile. Okay, so we've defined a term early on. I might circle that on test day. It makes sense if you're familiar with public transportation, if you've taken a bus or a subway before. You know, sometimes when you stand, you have to like hang on the strap to keep your balance. So that's what we're doing there. All right, but let's keep moving. Quick pace. Half the population of New York, Toronto, and London do not own cars. Okay, cool data. A century and a half after the invention of the internal combustion engine, private car ownership is still an anomaly. All right, so we're doing what we do in a lot of science passages, which is setting the stage. We set what is the norm, and then we talk about how things might deviate from that norm. Here's what's typical, and here's what's coming, in other words. Yet, public transportation in many minds is the opposite of glamour. And I think we can just stop right there. All they're doing is expanding on that idea. So it's not a glamorous thing in most of our minds. Hopping in a car always gets you to your destination more quickly. It doesn't have to be like this. Okay, this is huge. Now we're moving from the status quo to something new. And I might even keep reading here. Done right, public transportation can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper than the private automobile. All right, that's our thesis, right? That's probably this whole paper in just one sentence. And what do we got as this paragraph wraps up? Some cities have transformed their streets into cycle path freeways, blah, 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 in the process, turning the workaday bicycle into a viable form of mass transit. Okay, so it looks like if I kind of scan my eyes over this paragraph, they're giving like different examples, like different places that are doing it differently than the US. If you credit the demographers, this transit trend has legs. Okay? So if you've heard that idiom before, if something has legs, that means it has strength. It's actually going somewhere. It can stand on its own. It's kind of what that metaphor means. So they're going to talk about how this trend increases in strength. And sometimes I would recommend, yeah, read the entire conclusion paragraph. But this conclusion paragraph is like most of the passage, so probably not. But let's read this last sentence. The experience of European and Asian cities show that if you make buses, subways, and trains convenient, comfortable, fast, and safe, a surprisingly large percentage of citizens will opt to ride rather than drive. Okay, that's another like potential thesis, right? The whole paper. And here we have some graphs. Now, I'm not going to try to internalize the graphs at all, okay? I'm only going to come back to these graphs when the questions demand that I do. Because remember, we're not We're not reading the questions for the passage, we're reading the passage for the questions. We're sort of interviewing, interrogating the passage until we get what we want from it, rather than the other way around. But let's look at our questions. We've read the blurb, we've sandwiched the passage. Now what are we going to do? Now, we're going to categorize our questions, right? We're going to take that bird's eye helicopter view and categorize these questions into broad line questions, vocab and context, or graph and data interpretation, which we will run into here. You never get graphs without a graph and data interpretation question. So what function does the third paragraph, number 11, what function does the third paragraph, lines 20 to 34, serve in the passage as a whole? Well, that seems pretty clearly to be a line question. So we can probably answer that pretty early on, though I may not, pardon me, I may not answer this first. Because this is asking about a whole paragraph, and I will generally favor the ones that are just asking about a few lines here and there before I get to these whole paragraph line questions. So on test day, I would likely just mark this with an L. Number 12, which choice does the author explicitly cite as an advantage of automobile travel in North America? Well, this seems like a broad question, doesn't it? Seems like something we would have to kind of read the whole passage to find out. Until we scroll down and realize that this is a connected question. This is an even better line question than the line question we just had. Because whatever the answer is here, the evidence for that answer is going to be somewhere in these excerpts. Hopefully you've all familiarized yourselves with the strategy that we use for these, but of course we'll be going over it together today. All right, so all line questions so far. What do we got here? Number 14. Central idea of the fourth paragraph, lines 35 to 57. Okay, well, that seems very clearly to be a line question. And lucky us, number 15 proves that these two are connected. We're not just being told, hey, it's somewhere in this paragraph. We're being told it's somewhere in one of these lines in the paragraph. That's awesome. That narrows it down even more. (16) and 17, both pretty clearly vocab and context. They're just asking for what credit and favor mean in the context that they're used in the passage. Those are two very different V's. Let me try that again. This may surprise you, but writing with a cursor is not always the most precise process. 16 and 17, vocab and context. We will answer those bad boys right away. Which choice best supports the conclusion that public transportation is compatible with the use of personal electronic devices? And the options we're given are all lines, are all parts, specific parts of the passage. So that for sure is a line question, right? Now, I promise we get there. We get to our first graph and data interpretation questions, asking about, these figures in particular. Sometimes it asks about just one. Sometimes it asks about the two figures together, but these are both graph and data interpretation. Okay? Okay, so what's the order we're going to solve these in? Well, we said already, we want to solve the vocab and context questions first. Those are some easy points for us, right? So as used in line 58, credit most nearly means. So we're going to find line 58. And it's right here. We've read it already. If you credit the demographers, this transit trend has legs. So these are people who are telling us that these trends are actually continuing. We don't have to exactly know what a demographer is. You could probably figure it out though through just some basic interpretation of word parts. You've probably seen demographics before, right? We talk about voting demographics, customer demographics. These are populations, okay, that may differ over places or over time. And as we see here, they're mostly concerned with different populations over time, like millennials, baby boomers, that sort of thing. So if you credit the demographers, this transit trend has legs. Well, if the demographers are telling us this, then we would need to what? We would need to like believe them. We would need to trust them. The thing I like to do, and I've shown you this before, cross out the word and ask, what else could I fit in there? So yeah, if you trust the demographers, if you believe the demographers, we could think of some other synonyms there. But if we look back at our choices to see what matches what we already know, believe is clearly our strongest answer. Yeah, endow the demographers. No, I'm not giving them anything, any endowment. Attribute, you could definitely see how credit means attribute in other ways, right? Like, hey, give me some credit. But it doesn't mean that here. We're not citing them at the bottom of a paper. If we honor the demographers, well, no, we're not being asked to respect them, just to believe the information that they're giving us. Let's look at line 61, favor. And this is why I tell y'all like not to look at these before we've looked at the context, because almost any of these could serve as a synonym of favor in another context. What we're interested is how it's used in line 61. There she is. So let's read the whole sentence. The millennials who reached adulthood around the turn of the century and now outnumber baby boomers tend to favor cities over suburbs and are far more willing than their parents to ride buses and subways. So if you're favoring cities over suburbs, what does that generally mean? Well, what else could we plug in there? They tend to prefer cities over suburbs. Honestly, we could put in the word tend to. They tend to cities over suburbs. They're inclined to cities over suburbs. Lean toward, maybe, if we wanted to get a little fancier with it. But what matches prefer? That synonym we already have in our head? Boom. Yeah, to indulge the cities? Well, no, we're not granting them a favor. To resemble the cities, I really hope that these people don't look like a city. To serve the cities? No, they just like them better. You can see how favor might mean serve in another context, but not as it's used in line 61. All right, so we have killed our vocab and context. Easy money right there. Let us look at our line questions. Now, I said already, we're not going to start with this one just because, well, it's a little broad. Which choice does the author explicitly cite as an advantage of automobile travel in North America? Okay, so because these two are connected, right, we know that whatever the answer is, it's going to be found in here, but probably not in these exact words. So what do we want to do? Well, let's highlight our keywords. Look for our action words. So we have here the word explicit. Now that means really clear, right? There's nothing implied here. So it might not be the exact words, but it is going to be an exact synonym at the very least, and it might be in the exact words. As an advantage of automobile travel, okay, in North America. All right, so we know we have to be talking about cars in North America, and it has to be cited as a good thing. That's key. So let's find something that actually has to do with automobile travel in North America. Lines 5 to 9, starting with in and ending with automobile. Well, looks promising so far. In other words, traveling to work, school, or the market means being a strap hanger, somebody who, by choice or necessity, relies on public transport rather than a privately owned automobile. No, I don't think that really talks about the advantage of having a car. That's more about, here's why some people have to use public transit. Lines 20 to 24, starting with and ending in car. And yet, public transportation in many minds is the opposite of glamour, a squalid last resort for those with one too many impaired driving charges, too poor to afford insurance, or too decrepit to get behind the wheel of a car. Well, okay, that definitely talks about why public transit isn't fun, not necessarily why owning a car is good. So I won't cancel it out right away, but let's see if we can find something stronger. Lines 24 to 26, starting with in, ending in experience. In much of North America, they are right. Taking transit is a depressing experience. Well, okay, so it's talking about more of the negatives of public transit. But if we have two options that are doing the same thing, they're kind of going to cancel out. Neither of those is a clear winner. Let's look at lines 32 to 34, starting with hopping and ending with quickly. Hopping in a car almost always gets you to your destination more quickly. There we go. We didn't even have to insult public transportation. We just have to talk about why being in a car is more convenient. It's an advantage. Well, so what's the advantage given here? Notice the word quickly. Speed is the big advantage, right? We don't have to wait. So I like D the best here. And for 12, yeah, environmental impact, that's not really an option given. Convenience, well, sort of. That's pretty broad though. Speed is the big one. You get there quickly. Cost doesn't really come up. So I think C is our best answer there. Let's keep moving through the line questions. The central idea of the fourth paragraph is that, well, okay. Now we have to come up with what the main idea is of this paragraph. And actually, before we do this sort of like double process of elimination, I think we're ready. I think we're ready for number 11. Let's look at our third paragraph before we get to the fourth one. Now remember, they're asking us for the main idea of the third paragraph, but also its service in the context of the whole passage. So we have some idea of what the whole passage is doing, right? They're saying that public transit can be good. It can work. We get that here. The experience of European and Asian cities shows that if you make these things convenient, comfortable, fast, and safe, then more people will opt for public transit. And we see it here, done right. Public transport can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper than the private automobile. So our third paragraph, well, what does that serve to do? We've read this already about how it's a squalid, inglamorous experience in the minds of many North Americans. Let's read the rest of the paragraph. Anybody who has waited far too long on a street corner for the privilege of boarding a lurching, overcrowded bus or wrestled luggage onto subways and shuttles to get to a big city airport knows that transit on this continent tends to be underfunded, ill-maintained, and ill-planned. Given the opportunity, who wouldn't drive? Hopping in a car almost always gets you to your destination more quickly. We've read that already too. So while the author seems to be in favor of moving toward public transportation, he is acknowledging that I just had to check. I don't even know if like Terrace is a man or a woman's name, so I'll just call them the author. The author is acknowledging here that there are some definite drawbacks to public transit in North America. So what are some synonyms to like what we're finding here? Well, like we might think of disadvantages. We might think of, like I said, drawbacks, inconveniences, undesirables. So number 11, what does this serve in the passage as a whole? A, it acknowledges that a practice favored by the author of the passage has some limitations. Well, that does seem to be it. Like it's not forming a new conclusion. It's saying, no, I still favor this idea, but there are some downsides to it. It illustrates with detail the arguments made in the first two paragraphs of the passage. Pardon me. Well, we've had a pretty good idea of what's going on in the first two paragraphs. It's talking about how a lot of people don't own cars, and a lot of people have to do public transportation. And then this is talking about how it's really lame. So I don't think it really expands on the ideas. It's more of a left turn. C, it gives an overview of a problem that has not been sufficiently addressed by the experts mentioned in the passage. That I might flag. And again, this is why this is trickier. Because we don't really know what the experts in the passage want. D, it advocates for abandoning a practice for which the passage as a whole provides mostly favorable data. Abandoning a practice. No, I don't think that's it either. So what I'm going to do, and you can do this on test day, I'm not going to answer this right away. I'm going to come back to it when I have a better idea of the passage. Thought we were ready? Not quite. But rather than waste time reading through what all the demographers are saying, let's, get that same information as we rack up more points. So let's look at our next line question. Central idea of the fourth paragraph is which? Well, again, this may seem just as intimidating. Where are we? This is paragraph 4. Now we've already looked through this, right? Done right, public transport can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper than the private automobile. And we don't have to look very hard at the specific examples to see that, oh, okay, here are some examples of how it's being done in other nations. So this paragraph is just basically saying it can be done. So which do I feel actually sums up the main point of the 4th paragraph? Let's do number 15 first. Well, it's the one that we've highlighted already. Not it doesn't have to be like this, because that doesn't really, I don't know, that doesn't give the clearest answer. What's it and what's this? It's much more clear in the following sentence. Done right, public transport can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper than the private automobile. So that definitely gives us the point of the main passage. Let's look at these other ones, though. 37 to 40, starting with in, ending with sound. In Shanghai, German-made magnetic levitation trains skim over elevated tracks at 266 miles an hour, whisking people to the airport at a third of the speed of sound. Interesting. I don't think that sentence alone gives us the main idea of the paragraph. Lines 44 to 48, starting with from and ending with cities. There we go. From Spain to Sweden, Wi-Fi equipped high-speed trains seamlessly connect with highly ramified metro networks, allowing commuters to work on laptops as they prepare for same-day meetings in once distant capital cities. Okay, no, that's an example. That's not the main idea. That's just another example, exactly like that, like the Shanghai example. So B is our clear answer, that if we do things right, we can make public transportation preferable. Whoops. If we do things right, we can make public transportation preferable to just auto driving. So what's the central idea of the 4th paragraph? European countries excel at public transportation. Well, I mean, that is true. We definitely see it illustrated there. Some public transportation systems are superior to travel by private automobile. Yeah, I think that's a much stronger connection because we're specifically talking about that comparison in option B. Americans should mimic foreign public transportation systems when possible. Again, that's not a point that the author would necessarily disagree with, but it's not what we see in paragraph 4. In paragraph 4, we just see a lot of examples. Option D, much international public transportation is engineered for passengers to work while on board. Yeah, that's there, but it's not most clearly related to what we found here. So while this point is valid, that some European countries do excel at public transportation, the main point is that they're being, is to compare them to automobile travel. That's why I like option B the best. Excuse me, it's my insulin pump. All right, we're all good. Let's look at our next line question here. This one isn't even connected. We'll get through this real quick. Which choice best supports the conclusion that public transportation is compatible with the use of personal electronic devices? Okay. So a couple keywords here. We definitely want to find something about public transportation. If it doesn't bring that up, we're not interested. We want to find something that's giving a pro, right? Showing that it's actually compatible, that the two can work together with personal electronic devices. So it has to mention both, and it has to mention both in a positive connective way. Let's start with lines 59 to 63, starting with the and ending with subways. The millennials, who reached adulthood around the turn of the century and now outnumber baby boomers, tend to favor cities over suburbs and are far more willing than their parents to ride buses and subways. Okay, that has to do with public transportation. It has nothing to do with personal electronic devices. Don't like A. 63 to 67, starting with parts, ending with annoyances. Part of the reason is their ease with iPads, MP3 players, Kindles, and smartphones. You can get some serious texting done when you're not driving, and earbuds offer effective insulation from all but the most extreme commuting annoyances. I think that's our money one right there. Explicitly mentions the relationship between personal electronic devices. Let's keep reading, because this is going to give us some context for that other line question. And it'll help us, just sort of solidify the answer in our own mind. 68 to 70, starting with even, ending with a go. Even though there are more teenagers in the country than ever, only 10 million have a driver's license versus 12 million a generation ago. Interesting fact, not relevant to electronic devices. '77 to 81, starting with already, ending with homes. Already, dwellings in older neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Denver, especially those near light rail or subway stations, are commanding enormous price premiums over suburban homes. Again, interesting, not relevant to electronic devices. But the upside of all this may feel like a waste of time going through all this when we had such a clear right answer. But now we have some additional context for this paragraph when we go back to number 11. What function does the third paragraph serve in the passage as a whole? Well, we know what the experts in the passage have suggested now. They're talking about, this generational shift. So does this one right here, all about how public transportation can be the opposite of glamour and it can be crowded and nasty, does this have anything to do with what these guys don't cover? Not been sufficiently addressed. That kind of seems like we're expecting them to address it, but that's not what demographers cover. They cover populations. They don't cover like how crowded a bus is. So A, which we kind of favored already, is our right answer. The third paragraph gives some downsides to something that the author generally thinks is a good idea. Now we're ready to move into our graph and data interpretation questions. '19, which choice is supported by the data in the first figure? Well, unfortunately, this doesn't give us a whole lot, right? A lot of times these data questions will be like, what does this population do with this thing? Like they'll actually give us some factors to play with. These are just kind of giving us a bunch of interpretations of that first graph and are asking us to choose which one is right. But it won't take a lot. All we have to do is plug and play. A, the number of students using public transportation is greater than the number of retirees using public transportation. Let's look at the graph. And remember, we're only looking at figure 1. And what's it measuring? The primary occupation of public transportation passengers in US cities. Okay, so it has to deal with the jobs that these people have. And we're being asked, do students outnumber retirees in public transport? Well, let's see, students are at 10.7. Retired is at 6.7. Yeah. Yeah, we don't have to work too hard on that one. I mean, if you're worried about it, you can always go through and check. This is something I'd recommend to do if you have time at the end of the test. Like the number of employed people and the number of unemployed people is roughly the same. No, these are the unemployed people, and these are those employed outside the home, not even counting homemakers. Not at all the same. People employed outside the home are less likely to use public transportation than our homemakers. No, again, they're a huge demographic, those employed outside the home. Unemployed people use public transportation less often. Unemployed people use public transportation less often than do people employed outside the home. Well, that would seem to connect at first, right? But we're not talking about frequency. That's key here. Notice how the keywords here are they use it less often. We're talking about the numbers of people who do it, not how often they do it. It may seem like we're splitting hairs, but that's what makes A the good answer and not D. Is that this is talking about greater numbers and this is talking about frequency, which is not what's being measured here. Now this one is asking about both figures. Taken together, the two figures suggest that most people who use public transportation are what? Well, let's see. In figure 2, the purpose of public transportation trips in US cities. Again, we shouldn't waste our time trying to internalize all of this. I do see one clear outlier. If we're talking about the most people, what most people are doing, seems like most people are employed outside of their homes and are traveling to work. Let's see if we have an answer that actually lines up with that. Oh, look at that. It's option A. I swear I didn't try that. Are employed outside the home and take public transportation to work. Yeah, that seems to be the one that lines up with both of them at once. Are employed outside the home but take public transportation primarily in order to run errands. Know that we don't really have an errands portion here unless you look at personal and other, and again, that's not the outlier. Use public transportation during the week but use their private cars on weekends. That's not even a thing that's covered here. That's a misdirect. Use public transportation only until they are able to afford to buy a car. Again, not a thing that these tables are covering. That might be true, that might not be true. The graphs don't tell us, and we're only being tested on what the graphs say. What we're going to do now is go into the writing and language portion of SAT Practice Test 3.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.